Hello, my name is Walterio Mayol, and I'm a professor at Computer Science Department at the University of Bristol in the UK. I am also a principal research scientist at Amazon in the US, but today I'm going to talk only about my work at the university. And the topic of my talk here is about egocentric affordance and skill determination from video. I have been interested in egocentric perception for about 20 years plus, and I believe that this is one area where we can connect a lot of what is happening in not just robotics and autonomous systems, but also wearable computing and in general intelligence that is derived from the point of view of who is perceiving, which has many advantages. And therefore, in my research group, we have been working with my students and collaborators in a number of problems that have to do with precisely how a platform that is moving in the world, that is interacting with the world, can perceive and understand what is happening. So some of the early works that I've been involved in, this is 2003. This is one of the earliest examples of wearable visual SLAM. So SLAM that is perceived from the moving platform. And this is some work that Andrew Davison and I did together when we were at Oxford. So we combined this wearable robotic active camera with his then SLAM system that was monocular, and we were able to build these 3D representations that allowed us to put information in the world in terms of augmented reality annotations. And after these annotations were attached to the spatial map, then we could essentially ask that active camera to observe and reobserve these locations. So the intention of this work was to emulate some support system where you have someone that is remotely providing assistance, and that person has a much better understanding about what the environment around is, independently of whoever is carrying that egocentric or wearable camera. And then some other work that in my lab we've been doing has to do with this activity on enabling agile platforms to navigate in a complex world. And in this particular example that I'm showing here, we're using a new type of visual sensor, which actually combines a sensor and a processor. So it's what we call a pixel processor array that has been developed by my colleagues at the University of Manchester. And in this case, because every pixel has a processor, very simple processor, analog processor, but still a processor, we're able to do perception at high speeds, thousands of frames per second, depending on what we're running on board and at the moment that the image is being perceived. So we have a line of work on this. If you're interested, contact me or have a look at my research page. And then this is another connection with robotics and egocentric perception. In this case, what we're doing is we have a handheld robot that has a gaze tracker. So the robot is observing what the person is looking at and making inferences about what the person wants to do. This is a new type of robot that we have also developed in my group that, again, we call handheld robots. So these are robots that look and have the shape of a handheld tool, but they have understanding about the environment. They know what the task should be, and they communicate or perceive the user in order to act better. So this is a quick clip I will just play for you to see some of this work.
In this study, we explored gaze-based intention prediction for handheld robots. Here, the yellow line represents the user's gaze and object sizes indicate intention probabilities. The model was tested in 3 behavior modes. In the cooperative follow intention mode, the robot moves towards the predicted aim. In the Rebel mode, the robot avoids the predicted aim and chooses a different available object instead. This sometimes led to situations where there was a mismatch between user and robot motion, so that users had to correct their plans. For a neutral reference, the robot moves to a random object in the third mode. We found that the robot is perceived more cooperative when it adapts its plans to users compared to imposing them.
I do believe that handheld robotics, it's a bridge between totally independent robots that we usually expect to have. Let's say a humanoid robot that is totally independent from a person, sometimes may cooperate with a person to solve tasks, or even a vacuum cleaner that is also meant to work independently. So that's one spectrum of robotics. And on the other spectrum, we have wearable exoskeletons that are actually sometimes even designed with the user's dimensions, so that they can fit and work together. In the case of a handheld tool that has task knowledge, we believe it's a new opportunity for robotic devices and perception in particular to act by benefiting from what the human is capable of doing and what the robot is capable of doing, and together they're able to solve tasks. But what I mostly want to talk in this talk today is two pieces of work. The first one has to do with some work that we have been doing. These are two of my students, Eduardo and Abel. Eduardo already completed his PhD with me on this topic, and what we're interested here is in trying to bring a new way in which we can make the understanding and the representation of the world work better. And so I will be talking about this, and this has to do with the topic of affordance determination. And let me start with this very basic example. So what you can see here is an image of an object. And if I ask you, what is this object? I am sure the majority of you will be saying, well, this is a glass. And if I ask for what a glass is good for, what can it enable us to do, the vast majority of all of us will say, well, it allows us to drink water from it, or put some liquid at least in there. However, the reality of the world is not organized in the way in which when we want to force it to be organized with our semantics. Because this object is not only enabling us to do this particular action, it also can help for a number of other actions. It can serve as a paperweight if we want, or it can even help us to build castles with sand. So, and these are just only a few of the potential uses of what this object is about. This very basic example hopefully helps us to understand that we really need to often rethink the way in which we are formulating the problems in robotics or AI in general. Because the fact that this object is not only one thing is very important and very telling. And this really impacts the way in which we are going to design our systems, because the classical way in which systems are designed today have to do with how we collect our data and how we use the data. So the classic approach that is currently being used is, let's say, a mass data approach, where we have a couple of modalities. Let's say in the supervised way in which we can use this type of AI and machine learning, is that we have a machine learning model that requires some data, often millions of pairs of examples, which have this form. We expect to collect the vast or the most of the examples that we can gather for a particular class, and we attach a label to all these objects that are here. And then we expect this model to be able to use this data so that when another object similar to this, maybe in between some of the objects that it has seen, it also is able to recognize such a thing as the arbitrary label that we are assigning it for. The alternative to this mass data approach is slightly better, not quite, but slightly better, because we expect it to work in an unsupervised or semi-supervised manner. And in this case, we still have our machine learning model. We have, again, data, maybe a bigger set of data is expected when we're wanting to have an unsupervised or semi-supervised approach. And the way in which this will work, perhaps, is there are different ways in which this works, but one of them is that we still assign a label to a subset of these example objects. And then by another mechanism, maybe clustering, the system is able to reuse that information in order to expand these classes of labels that we assign, and therefore we end with again another system that is able to attach a label to the objects that we are collecting in here. However, there is another approach. Actually, it's a much earlier approach before deep learning. This was, and to some degree, this remains one of the main problems in artificial intelligence. Is the one that is centered around representation. So the objective of this alternative approach is to find a representation that we can then use with the hope that this representation is far more general than the one that is obsessed with data capture. So in order to achieve this, we will need to have some representation builder. So there will be a mechanism. This can actually be a human that is providing the information of how this representation should work, or it can be an optimized approach, an optimization-based approach that produces the representation that is then later used. So this representation builder will have to have still some data, which then delivers a representation, which is then used by a machine learning model, from which one of the hopes is that because this is a representation-based approach, the amount of both the data and the size of the model are smaller. And I will be talking about one example on how we've been working along these lines. But the key here is that there is a representation that is at the center of what we're trying to do. So it's less of an obsession about having these masses of data that we have to label in an arbitrary way. And notice that now here I am highlighting that some of these extra data that is put into this model that then works with is aiming to, in the case of affordances, aiming to understand how we can use this object. It's no longer an arbitrary label of a glass or a chair. We're trying to understand how we can use this object for a particular need. So this brings us to the concept of affordances. So the concept of affordances was introduced by Gibson in the 1970s, and it's a elusive concept. There have been even two different branches of how to understand what Gibson have been proposed in terms of affordances, from the design approach and from the experimental psychology approach. But the idea behind affordances is that it is something that allows us to recognize what we can do with something or where we can do something, even if we have never seen that object or place before. So this is key. This is, of course, is a dream for machine learning systems at the moment, because it's a way in which we're saying there is enough information out there in the object itself and in what we want to do, so that we can actually make a decision about if that something can happen in there. So it's less about building pairs of lots of examples. It's more about understanding that interaction. Importantly, in my opinion, this is something that can rescue us from surrendering to an obsession of masses of data. So again, an affordance is indeed something that has been attempted to be defined and formalized in a number of ways. But there is something that most of the people that work with affordances or are interested in affordances do agree with. And that is that in the specific case of an interaction between objects, the affordance is something that exists between that interaction. It's something that exists between, let's say, the scene and the object that we want to interact with. And it's not, and this actually comes from Gibson himself, is not about trying to classify things into categories. So it's not an obsession in trying to classify this is a chair. It's, can I actually sit down in this location? That's the main thing that affordances will be looking for. And there is now the work that we've been working with Eduardo and Annabelle, which has to do with something that we call the interaction tensor. And the interaction tensor is something that is based on a very relatively old, well understood concept in computational geometry, which is called the bisector surface. And so what we have here, this is a toy example where there is an object in blue here and a scene object in there in green. And the bisector surface is something that exists between the two objects that are interacting. So in this case, the interaction is the ball is placed on top of the table, or the ball is placed on the surface. The interaction that happens between these two objects can be formulated as something that has to do with the bisector surface, this geometrical construct that exists between these two objects. And this is how we based our representation for the interaction between these two objects. And so what we do next after we compute the bisector surface is we sample that, and we end with a number of points that are sampling the bisector surface. And from these points, then we calculate what we call provenance vectors. So these vectors are the vectors that essentially say from where that sample point came from one of the objects. In this case, the scene object is connected to the bisector surface via this vector, and the collection of all these vectors is what we call the interaction tensor. So it's a collection of vectors, and this collection of vectors represents the interaction between these two objects. This is very straightforward notionally, and with the optimizations that are possible to build around this, also computationally very straightforward. Now, why is this important? Why is this important for affordance determination? Well, one of the things that is very powerful about the description that we're finding here with the interaction tensor is that it is very, very general. So that, for example, if we have a scene, which is this sink in there, kitchen sink, if we put an object that interacts with, let's say, the faucet here with the tap, the interaction tensor that we can compute between these two objects is the one that we have here. We actually don't use all the vectors that that are shown here. We do subsample, but just to illustrate better, we're showing all these vectors in here. But if we actually change the object, so we keep the same scene object and we change the object, let's say this jug over here, the interaction tensor that we have here is fairly similar. even if we're changing these objects. Why? Because the way in which the geometry between these two objects is interacting is relatively similar, and that leads to this bisector surface, which after sample and with the provenance vectors results in this interaction tensor that despite changing the objects, all of them are able to contain a liquid. That's important. We can have very similar looking interaction tensor. So this is very powerful because from a single example, we're able to obtain a sample representation that we can in principle apply to a number of similar objects without having to see all those other objects in advance. In this case is we're inverting the situation where we're actually changing the scene object. So we have a chair, we have a rack in here, and so on, even the sink over here, and we keep the same object. So in this case is a coat hanger that we just want to hang wherever it appears appropriate in here. So in this case, the interaction tensor that we can obtain from these interactions is also very similar, even if the objects are fairly different, because the local interaction that exists between these two objects is very similar. It allows you to produce this vector representation that is very similar. So we have a paper in ICRA 2018 that is like the first paper. It talks about the most simplest way in which you can use this, and as you can see, is very general. So this is just a video that that illustrates what's happening here. The way in which we use the interaction tensor. We essentially compute these vectors from where we sample them. We use a single example for each one of these interactions, and then after we do that, then we actually go and test different points in the world to see what affordances we appear to be able to complete in there. So in the case of a robot, let's say this is a robot that is within a simulated world, moving in that world and trying to find out where can it perform different actions. So in this case, where can it place a bottle, or where can it expect a human to be sitting, for example. So the robot is exploring the scene, and in the scene, the interaction tensor is enabling us to make decisions about where the most likely locations where this geometrical form, which is a human in a sitting down position, could be sitting. So this could be helpful for the robot to understand where to expect to see humans sitting down. And importantly, again, this all comes from a single example between that humanoid shape and a chair in that case, and the system has never seen this living room and these objects that are in here. And yet, from that single example, the system is able to make inferences about where more likely we're able to see these interactions. And one thing that I'm particularly happy with is that with these general representations, you're able to find even in highly noisy environments some of these interactions. So for example, in here, where can you place that coat hanger? The system is even able to find examples here where you can hang a coat hanger on the edge of a table, and the system never saw that happening. It saw it hanging on a tube, yet the local geometry is very similar, and therefore is able to make that judgment that action can happen in that location. And again, from a single example, we're able to do these things. And this is the other thing that is very interesting. I remember my son, when he was about 3 years old, he pretended to play that the sofa was a motorcycle. So if you were a kid and you wanted to simulate that you're riding a motorcycle, where in this space will you do that? Well, very likely will happen in a location like that. And we have compared this approach with both deep learning-based methods, which of course break very, very quickly when you don't have enough data to train the systems, and certainly will never be able to cope in the way they are currently formulated with a single example. Yet in this case, you're able to find significant numbers of valid placements in scenes that the system has never seen before. We have tested this with Mechanical Turk analysis, where we ask people which method it looks like it's more correct, and in favor is towards the interaction tensor. We have also compared with some other approaches like ICP, for example, which is another geometric method that is commonly used to make inferences about the interaction between two objects in 3D. And more recently, we have also combined some of these approaches of deep learning with the interaction tensor in a way that we can benefit from the very straightforward representation that the interaction offers, and then benefit from some of the things that deep learning is able to offer in a much more robust way, specifically the case of saliency. So we have a paper in Frontiers Neurorobotics last year that precisely talks about how to combine that deep learning approach with the interaction tensor, which essentially what happens is that we're able to again do a lot of affordance inferences. In this case, we have more than 92 affordances that we're able to detect in real time in a way that is much better and faster than the alternative deep learning methods that we have tested for comparison. And yeah, so I guess this is an area that still needs a lot of development, but one where there is significant potential from the point of view of enabling robots that from a single example they're able to understand better the world. And here you can see a lot of other examples where all these scenes, the system never saw any of these objects. The system was trained for each one of these interactions with a single object, and we're able to take that into scenes that are either synthetic or in this case RGBD, and we can find a lot of fairly sensible placements. So let's say in this case there is a living room, and the placement of these objects is purely based on the interaction tensor. There is no script behind. We never asked it to find two people talking to each other, but if there are two sofas in there, then the system detects that affordance of sitting down can happen there, and therefore it places these objects in that way. So essentially what we're doing here is that representation is the interaction tensor. That representation comes from computational geometry, but in the latest work, this representation together with some data that we generate thanks to the representation. So after we have that single example, we actually run all those affordances in a number of RGBD scenes. That running, given that we have validated this with Mechanical Turk experiments, we trust that whatever the interaction tensor finds in these RGB scenes is high quality. With that information, we actually train a deep learning method to try to help us with the saliency aspect, because that is one of the slowest parts of this method here, where to find locations where we believe an affordance can happen. So what we do is we train a deep learning not to do the affordance inference, because we can do that much better with the interaction tensor, but to find the likely locations where affordances could happen, at least the affordances that the system has seen before. And so that's what we do. We generate this data from the interaction tensor that trains a saliency model. And then later, just with a single example, we're able to, again, do this ability of we see an object in the scene that we have never seen before, and then we know that we can perform the same affordance of hanging for this specific object. And so the more details of that is in our Frontiers Neurorobotics paper. And recently, Abel Pacheco has in my group has been taking this to the next level. So we're now looking at more complex interactions. So in this case, again, RGBD scenes in there, but now the objects are have many more degrees of freedom. In this case, let's say we have a humanoid figure in there that is able to be posed in a number of ways. We try to find how a specific pose can happen in different locations. This is another example where the system just finds things that it feels that they can happen in that way in those locations, and they come from, again, a single example. And this is another very interesting one. So this is an RGBD scene. There is a chair and a sofa there. The system does find where that person could be sitting in that chair and in the sofa, but also in other very likely locations that humans actually use. In this case, in the edge of the sofa, or in this object here, a cabinet that is not a chair, is not a sofa. However, a human will actually attempt to sit in those locations if they have to. And again, this speaks to the difference that exists between how a traditional deep learning method will approach a problem like this, where you will actually have to train all these potential different objects and ways in which that affordance can happen. In the case of the interaction tensor, because we're centering the effort into the representation, we don't have to. We can benefit from a single example and be able to find all these interactions. Okay, so that is part one of the talk. In this second part, I also want to talk about a related aspect, but this one has to do with skill understanding, skill and manipulation from video, and how we can use this information from the egocentric perspective in order to understand the world better. And the relationships that exist between what I was talking about a moment ago about affordances and the skill aspect of this work has to do with something that humans and actually other animals are able to do very well. Yet something that is super important for us to be able to learn. So when I was talking about affordances, I was highlighting that from a single example, we're able to generalize that and apply that information and knowledge into a number of other situations that we have never seen before. And that is actually one of the things that we humans are very, very good at. So if you see someone making fire in a particular way, that is better than the way that you know how to make a fire, you're going to copy that other person. And because you have that capacity through what is normally known as the motor mirror neurons, that allows us to understand what is the type of motions and actions that are happening that we see, how we will be able to reproduce. So when we observe someone doing something with their hands, we immediately trigger the same parts in our brain that actually control our hands in the same way that we're observing that other person doing, so that it actually helps us and gives us an idea of how we will be able to copy and imitate that other thing that we're seeing. So this, of course, is extremely important for humans to learn, but for a robot, it will also be extremely useful. And of course, there is quite a lot of work attempting to do this very same thing. That from a single example, we observe someone doing something, and then we already have an idea of how we can try to reproduce that. And maybe through a few other experiments and practice, we're going to improve or maybe just after one observation, we're going to be able to succeed how to solve a problem. And the interesting thing is that this is not exclusive to humans, because other animals are able to do that. So this is a video that I love to show, is from Dr. Anna Wilkinson from the University of Lincoln, that has studied this problem in animals. And let me play this video that shows how other animals are able to also copy from a single demonstration.
Settles in to watch the movie where the hero dragon opens the gate. But will it help him solve the problem and get to the snack? An initial bout of headbanging suggests he's forgotten what he's seen in the video. But suddenly, Oscar makes a breakthrough, and he's gulping down his grubby reward. He's copied the dragon in the video almost perfectly, using his front foot to slide the gate to the left. For the 8 bearded dragons tested in this way, the results were the same. The dragons that didn't see the solution in the video couldn't do it, but the dragons that did were munching mealworms within seconds. Anna has clear settles in to watch. So
what's important about that? Many things for sure, but it just demonstrates that the ability to imitate and copy, is something that enables us to solve problems, sometimes serious problems, important problems, and also we can do that just by observing. So that, of course, is very exciting from the point of view of egocentric visual perception, because it shows that it's indeed possible to use images and video to try to understand what people is doing. But it's not just that we want to just imitate anything that we see. We have to have other mechanisms that allows us to learn from the best. How can I, going back to that example of making fire, how can anyone make a decision about if that way of making fire is better than the way that I know how to make fire? We have to have a way in which we can decide who is better and who is best. And then we can try to copy from the best approach, the most efficient approach, so that we improve. So this is part of the work that we did with Hazel Doty, our student, and Dimadame, my colleague at Bristol University. And so this work is indeed, how can we do a ranking, a video ranking of how people do things? So we actually collected a new data set, and we annotated existing data sets. So we asked people to perform drawing copying, chopstick usage. Then from other data sets, we also annotated how people were doing pizza making or surgery. There are some data sets out there that we annotated specifically from the point of view of ranking. So we showed in Mechanical Turk pairs of videos to a lot of people, and we're able to find rankings of what people, just by observing, remember that thanks to our mirror neurons, we're able to make decisions about how that action is happening. We can copy it, and also we have other mechanisms that, combined with that, allows us to make a decision about what I'm looking is better than this other thing that is over here. So we ask people without much training to make decisions about how people is performing these actions, and they can give us some annotations and labeling from the point of view of ranking. And with this information, we were able to create a system that enables us to make those rankings within the data sets for which we have been trained for. So in this case, I don't have a solution for you yet in terms of what is that generic representation, similar to interaction tensors that we saw, that hopefully at some point that is developed. I do believe that exists because the fact that without any in-depth information, most people is able to make a call about seeing a pair of videos and making an assessment of who is doing better in that in one of those videos, makes me think that there has to be fairly universal way in which the quality of actions can be assessed. And that, of course, will be a very important milestone in robotics learning, so that robots can actually learn just by observing other people doing things and then able to decide from who they're going to copy and imitate. And then we have performed more work along the lines of this space, and this is some other more recent work in CVPR 2019, and I will let Hazel talk about what we did here.
When assessing skill in long video, there may be variability in the skill exhibited throughout a video. In this example, the left video shows better skill in egg cracking. However, as the videos proceed, higher overall skill is shown in the right-hand video. Trained attention can also exclude parts irrelevant for skill assessment. Next, present qualitative results. We show video segments with strong attention responses for the low skill module from various tasks. In surgery, strain on the material is a sign of low skill present in only low-ranked videos. In apply eyeliner, segments show mistakes being fixed. In origami, the module attends to undoing previous folds. For high skill module attention responses, consistent performance can be seen in the segments, with straightening edges in dough rolling and origami. Interestingly, for drawing, pausing to consider is indicative of high skill. Next, we show videos ranked by our method and demonstrate the varying attention over time. Response of the high skill module, in green, show increased attention when a bean is being picked up. The low skill module, shown in red, attends to difficulties in gripping beans. In Tai, we see that, for the most part, our method correctly ranks pairs of videos. It only struggles with pairs close in the ranking, such as the first and second videos displayed here. These are swapped in the ground truth. For longer tasks, such as scrambling eggs, filter responses are more sparse. Green demonstrates segments attended to by the high skill module, while red indicates the low skill module's attention weighting.
So as you can see in this more recent work, we went one step further in terms of the complexity of the actions that the system is aiming to rank. And also the model uses an attention approach where we try to identify parts of the video that contribute to either why this video should be ranked higher or why should it be ranked. And another data set that we recently released is what we call Epic Tent dataset. This accompanied a ICCB workshop 2019, but we released the dataset in 2020. And this is a dataset where we have asked 29 different people. We collected about 7 hours of video footage, and this is a task which is fairly complex, which is assembling a camping tent. So this is complex because it's a highly high degree of manipulation that is happening, and that that the object is not rigid. So the object is a tent that is being unfolded and changes shape as the person is interacting with it. The data set has eye tracking video, so we recorded it from an egocentric perspective, but we also have an eye tracker in here that we actually, because we were operating outdoors, we actually had to cover any entrances of external light so the eye tracker worked as reliably as possible. But we have this data set that we hope is going to help challenge current models further, specifically because the variety of the interactions that are happening and the fact that this is a non-rigid object. And then finally, in my group, Yao Lu, who is a PhD student with me, he has been working on trying to, once you have a video that is describing a task, how can you actually segment that video into the constituent steps? So what are the key steps that are required for you to actually achieve this task? And of course, this is important for robotic learning, for machine learning training. And in this particular case, we're interested in teaching from the egocentric perspective for an augmented reality system. So this work is captured in an upcoming publication in ISMAR 2021. And here's a video where essentially what we are able to do is the system is able to recognize what objects are being interacted with by the hands, and what objects are irrelevant for the task that is being conducted because they are not being interacted with. And after we have this information, then we're able to use it within other mechanisms that are described in the paper that include a finite state machine and some other ways in which we make decisions about how to merge and how to split sections of the video. At the end of the process, we're able to make a call about this is one step, this is another step, and this is yet another step. And therefore, we can monitor where first we can decompose a video into these key steps, and then after we can monitor how people is performing or getting stuck into one step in that process. So this is an example of the output. Notice that the number of clips is growing here for the right hand. So this is one action that is being recognized. This is the second action that is being recognized because it's a different object. The system is able to make a decision. The object that I saw before is different to the object that I'm seeing here. And then again, this is a third action that even if it is using the first object that has been used or the different objects that are being used in different steps, the system is able to make calls about this is one step, this is another step, and so on. And it's able to keep track of, let's say, what is the left hand doing and what is the right hand doing. So at the end, we can generate a system that splits into video segments, which are super useful for guidance. We haven't been able to perform the full guidance due to the COVID restrictions, given that we cannot test this with volunteers yet, but we've been able to at least do something close to Mechanical Turk, where we ask people what do they think about these steps and how will they segment that video and align that with the way in which experts that perform an action like this will segment those videos, and therefore we're able to see how close we are to having a consistent split of the information. So in this upcoming paper, we are going to release the code, but also a new data set, which is this Chinese tea-making data set. And we have also used other data sets that we test against. Okay, so with this, I will be closing my talk. Essentially, as a summary, I believe that it's very, very central that as a community, we come back, or at least don't ignore, the importance of looking for generic representations, rather than just being obsessed with collecting more data that can actually clog and distract us from some deeper understanding about the scenes. How can we combine those more recent tools that we have that are heavily centric on data with the emphasis on representation? And then the other very important thing that I believe that needs happening is how can we create these competencies that enable humans and animals to learn from the world, like being able to determine the level of skill that is being exhibited in a video, so that we can, with better confidence, learn from the information that is there. So with this, I will close my presentation. I love to talk about and discuss about these topics, affordances and skill ranking. If you are a student or a colleague that is interested in these topics, I would love to hear from you. It would be great to collaborate. There are many other ideas and interesting things that I believe are still to be done. So please reach out. Best wishes to everyone, and looking forward to hear from you, and hope you enjoy the rest of the workshop. Thank you.